Okay, welcome to this lunch lecture. My name is Pernilla Hagbert. I'm a researcher here at KTH at the School of Architecture and Built Environment at the Division of Urban and Regional Studies. And I should start by saying, so the lecture will be filmed and will be available on the library's website. As I just said, the lecture was intended to be in Swedish, but I'll do it in English, but with the Swedish slides. And there will be, I'll try and keep the time so that we'll have 10-15 minutes questions and comments at the end, and then just wave, and then we have this little box that we pass around since it's being filmed so that all your answers get recorded. I think that was the practicalities. So this lecture, A Sustainable Home, is based on the work that I've done from my PhD studies, which I actually did at Chalmers, but it's also connected to the research I'm doing here at KTH right now. And it's being published in a popular science book. So my thesis had the title, A Sustainable Home. And I always got this question, can you have a PhD thesis with a question mark in it? Aren't theses supposed to answer things? But I actually got it through. I got to have a question mark at the end. And this is important, and that's also a struggle I had with the Swedish publisher then, to have a sustainable home question mark. But that's coming just in a few months, and there are a few flyers over there as well. Sorry, that was my hair that got stuck in the microphone. Sorry about that. Okay, so a sustainable home. This question mark, as I said, is important because that is really the question. What is a sustainable home? Is there such a thing? And if there is, what would it look like? What would it mean? How would we know if we found it? And to start sort of off in this question of the basic question of a sustainable home, you have to start in these questions of what are the challenges we're facing? And I see a lot of students in here, you're students here at KTH, so therefore you are probably already well aware of the challenges we're facing. But some of these challenges, of course, have to deal directly with people's living environments, the settlements, the human settlements, how we organize space, how we organize everyday life, the resources that are associated with this, the social ramifications and relations and so on. But it also has to do with the cognitive aspects, who we are, what we do, why we do the things we do, and so on. But this image, which I took when I was an architecture student, and we did a course in Kenya. So this is from Kibera, informal settlement in Nairobi. This is sort of and I work a lot with images, particularly because they say certain things. And when I show you this image, I want to sort of say something, but you could also critically assess this type of image, except for the fact that it's sort of artsy. I was an architecture student after all. But this idea that this is sort of the core. It's these urban challenges, the global challenges we're facing, the access to adequate housing and so on. But I could also show this image, which is sort of cast as another aspect of this, the challenges, and this happens to be in the US, outside of Washington, D.C. This idea that this is also what we're struggling with. So this is a self-segregated area, I should say. This is people actually choose to live here, believe it or not, right? Every house looks the same. That's the whole point. If you don't adhere to certain social conventions or even written rules, you get banned from certain things in the community. So the whole idea here is based on social convention. You want to live in exactly the same way like your neighbor does. And this is another aspect, and it's very easy to talk about this in black and white terms, like, okay, this is for sure unsustainable. This is, we often talk about issues like urban sprawl, which is sort of this idea that we're building not so dense. So this is the typical urban sprawl, these suburban neighborhoods, very car dependent and so on. This is seen and talked about as being the unsustainable development that we want to sort of get away from. But remember, this was also an image of this unsustainable in the sense of what I talked about, access, for example, to infrastructure and so on. And what do we mean by that then? What is this sustainable framing that we need to understand this within? So I've explored this in different ways, but this is a model that me and my colleagues use a lot. And it's by a British researcher called Kate Raworth, and she's developed this donut model of a sustainable economy, you could say. So this is sort of an idea that planetary boundaries as the biophysical limitations, sort of the carrying capacity of the Earth to actually support and sustain human life on it. So it's a very human-centric and anthropocentric perspective on this, right? So it's what we can do within the limits of, for example, and these are based on Johan Rockström and others. Several of these limits we're already trespassing, of course. So that's one aspect of these planetary boundaries that Kate puts as the outer ring of this donut. So it's a donut that I put some trees on, but it's basically a donut that you can eat. That's the idea. And that we don't want to fall outside, but we also don't want to fall inside the donut hole, which is this social foundation. And Kate based this on reviewing what we as a global society consider being essential social development goals. So this was for the Rio +20 conference, for example, that she assessed this, but that has to do with access to certain resources, the right to education, equality, and so on. But what's interesting is also that this space in between, this safe and just sort of operating space, this is what we need to find, but this is not given. So the planetary boundaries, that has to do with uncertainty. What level of uncertainty are we willing to live with? The social foundation, that has a lot to do with how we define things, and this has also changed over the course of history. What do we see as the basic social development that we feel like everyone in society should have? This is not an easy task. Sustainability is not and cannot be consensual. It can't be based on, yep, okay, it's a win-win situation, we're all in this together, but it has to be, and this is what it's illustrating, has to be this constant negotiation. And the negotiation and the distribution of resources, which this is about, this is politics. So sustainability as political in its essence, that's sort of a way of looking at this. And what this means for housing development is also, it's this constant negotiation. We need to find sustainable housing development within the donut. So within these biophysical boundaries and these social, and I will add psychological aspects. So what do we see as a good life and so on? And this is not a new question. Of course, this has been discussed, and I focus on the Swedish context. This is an image from about 100 years ago. Beginning of the 20th century, we had a housing crisis, a housing crisis that was converging with other crises. But it was particularly sort of spurred also by a very unsecure tenure form. So there were a lot of private real estate owners, a lot of extreme rents being taken. It wasn't a controlled situation, basically. You could simplify it, which led to sort of in the Swedish context this development of a social policy, the politics of housing, as being very strongly developed during the 20th century. And basically this is sort of the housing shortage situation, right? So this could be described in similar images and ideas today where there's this talk about acute housing shortage. But it also has to do with more than that, and that's what interests me a lot. So this idea that we, as Sambo Mockbee, an US architect, talked about, that everyone, rich or poor, deserves a shelter for the soul. So this is a very nice way of saying this, but this is actually housing is a human right. So if you look at UN definitions and so on, and this is what it is. Housing, the access to decent housing, is not a matter of whom can access it or so on. It's a basic human right. So if we have that perspective, then it of course becomes, so if we all agree that that's sort of the definition, we could put that as the inner circle. Equal access to decent housing. That's a huge challenge in itself, of course, huge sustainability challenge. It also has to do with the social relationships created around housing. So this is an image from program I did as an architecture student, again, in rural Alabama, building a house for someone, but not only seeing that as the sort of, okay, here is a house, the physical structure, but also seeing the ramifications of that. So in this case, we built a house for a person that lived in a dilapidated trailer, so a mobile home with no running water or electricity. But by building the physical structure of a new house, you also introduce aspects that weren't there before. So I did the electrical work for this house, which you couldn't do in Sweden, but I did. And then that means that Mac, as the resident is called here, Mac now needs to pay an electric bill each month. We looked at how he lives his everyday life. So before, he had to, once a month, he got a lift to the store, and he bought ice and a few groceries, and then he kept his food on ice throughout the week. But he was also a very sociable person, so he spent a lot of time out on his front lawn, a lot of kids, neighborhood children, neighbors, and so on. So there's all these other elements of how do we understand what everyday life is like. And in this case, it's not necessarily so that just adding the physical infrastructure of a house is any type of solution. And that's sort of also the humble understandings of, again, 20-something architecture student, that this is not in itself a sustainable home. There are so many other aspects behind this and around this. And this has to do a lot with this idea that home as a concept, which I've studied a lot, but it's sort of both these it's the physical reflection or manifestation of cultural applications, practices, and beliefs. And that's the interesting part. So home is sort of this interface between society and the individual. It's where our own beliefs, our beliefs in ourselves and our part in the world are shaped, our role. But it's also, of course, where society is sort of pressured on us. And that also has to do a lot with how we conform to different norms. And the home is surrounded by a range of different norms. Social norms, but also more regulatory, of course, like laws and so on. But this idea of what makes a home and what's the difference between how we perceive and how we talk about home. We often say that it's very subjective. Well, I have my view on home, you have yours, and so on. That's true only to some extent. I've been very interested in the research that actually shows that this is very guided by these, as I said, social norms and cultural conventions. We're actually not that unique. So for example, again, going into friends' houses, architects have certain social conventions. I'll see a few markers. I can go into a friend's home and see, oh yeah, there's the Eames chair, and oh, there's this stringhylla bookshelf system, and so on. Those are the social conventions of my profession, for example. And that is not all too different from this image that I showed from the suburbia idea of Washington, D.C. It's the social conventions that we actively strive for. I mean, our identity and the whole notion of identity is in relation to something. It's not individualism, but rather identity is being part of a subgroup. Cultural relations and so on. And this, for example, in the case of home, also has to do with a lot of norms surrounding family and what is a good home life. So I'm currently leading a project looking at the intersection between gender norms and intersectional perspectives on sustainability. But that also has a lot to do with how we, for example, perceive what a family is. So this idea of home as we know it, you can say developed during the Industrial Revolution. Again, very simplified, brief historical review here. This is an image from the 1800s. This idea of the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois notion of home, which is very much still what we associate. We see home as something to do with privacy and intimacy, control, family, and so on. These are ideas that came very much in sort of the urban middle class homes of the Industrial Revolution, or industrialized modern society, you could say. But it's also this idea of, for example, what's a household? This nuclear family idea, which you can also see sort of throughout the 20th century as having shaped very much our idea of what home is, but where we today see completely different household constellations. And we think that's unique in time, but in a historical perspective, we've always lived in different ways. Different generations and different constellations and so on. So it's also interesting to think of what are these ideals and norms and what's the reality. This bourgeois urban home and the notion of that was a very small privileged group. The reality for most of history and most of, you can say, contemporary society is that this is not how people live. It's not home for a majority of people. But this ideal is still extremely strong. Also in an international perspective, and we talk here about acculturation, meaning that maybe 30, 40 years ago, researchers saw some, still there were differences in how people view home in different, for example, studies in Japan, in the US, in Scandinavia, and so on. Today we see that these differences are much smaller. This type of acculturation, meaning that basically the cultural differences are sort of wiped out in favor of this one quite strong ideal with which you could resemble to this Euro or American-centric version of sort of the Hollywood home that we've seen through popular culture and so on. But if you look at the Swedish development, this also has to do with how we understand these images that have been really significant. So this is from Swedish painter Carl Larsson, who, together with his wife, were extremely, you could say, trend-setting in the beginning of the 20th century in what is not only sort of this, which they worked a lot with, like interior, so color schemes and interior decoration, which has been very influential, but also in the whole image and idea of home. In this case, it's also been sort of critically analyzed in terms of that it was a very national romantic view. In most of the Carl Larsson's paintings, people are blonde and blue-eyed. It's not coincidental. But it's also this aesthetic, sort of these somber colors, the pastels, and so on. This idea of what you do in home is also reflected. I mean, here it's a scene where they're churning butter, but if you look at the paintings in a sort of wide variety, you also get a sense of the practices, what you do at home. In the advertising, you can also see this, of course. This is an advertisement for a catalog home in the 40s. This idea, and it says, live pleasantly. And I like these types of, again, images. And this has a lot to do with how we sell the concept of home. So it's not, I mean, when you're selling a house like this, it's not just a physical, technical object. You're selling an idea. This is, of course, very conscious. It's also this idea that, again, you here can see it reproduces certain nuclear family norms and so on, but it's also this idea, well, a pleasant life, you can live a pleasant life in a Myresjöhus. But together with this, and about the same time, there's also a very important development that's this sort of the rationale between everyday life and the common practices, what we do in the home. So this is an image from Hemmens Forskningsinstitut, which was like basically the research institute for the Home Research Institute, yeah, which was extremely important for, say, setting certain norms in terms of regulatory norms, but also how we understand. So this is basically a machine that measures the number of breaths this woman takes while she's doing the dishes, to see sort of, this is based on an average dishwashing amount for a family of 4. And this is part of sort of this very rational approach to understanding these different functions of home. It led to the development of architectural design guidelines, everyday life guidelines, you could also say, how we understand, in this case, what's the most efficient way to do dishes and how can you design for that, what's the most efficient kitchen, so on. We can now look back on this and see, of course, it was very dominated also by the idea that the woman is the one doing the dishes. So today, when we are designing the kitchens of the future, we're looking at how can we start unpacking these norms, because a lot of the kitchens built during this period are quite low, so that you basically a general average woman would be comfortable doing the dishes, but a man of 1.90 meters or something wouldn't be. So these types of understandings of what we do and who does it in home has also been influential in shaping the home. We talk about socio-technical developments, and here I use the example of first the radio. So this is a way to see how technical developments they're not in isolation. They're surrounded by different, again, social norms, social practices. So the radio came as a mass media, this idea of technical revolution in terms of bringing information into people's homes. But it needed a physical space. To beginning, the radio was a large piece of machinery. You had radio listening parties and so on, which again needed space. Not that many had a radio at home. It was expensive and big. As the technology developed, of course, it's more accessible, it's smaller, it's cheaper. But this idea of listening to the radio as a practice was now incorporated within what you do in a home, and it needed a physical space. But it's especially visible in the case of the TV. So few technical developments have had the impact on housing design, like architectural design of homes, as the TV. The car, of course, being another major aspect of this. But the TV, similarly, when it first came, it was sort of expensive, it was big, and then the technological development, which is what usually happens, means it's more efficient, demands less space and resources, and more widely available. But when I was an architecture student, I learned this, you design a living room by having a TV, and then it was the thick TV, and you have a 3-seated couch, and then you have 2 chairs on either side. And that's sort of how housing and living rooms have been designed. Now, of course, you could argue that, well, the technological development means that you can actually watch TV anywhere. You're not bound to a physical place, the living room, or a certain like a TV. But still, this is one of the most sort of, I would say, the thing that shapes how we understand both what is to be at home. So in my research, I do a lot of interviews, so this is something people associate with being at home, just watching TV with your family. There's a lot of social practices surrounding this, meaning that, for example, in Sweden, we have this idea of fredagsmys, like Friday cozy time with your family. So a social practice that also has food practices connected to it. That's all centered around TV and certain programs and watching them together. This is, of course, shifting, but this is to illustrate how strongly, even though the technological development is going off in one direction, the social norms are very strong. And still, architects design this. Now it's the flat screen TV that you can sort of place in different ways, but it's still TV, 3-seated couch, 2 chairs. That's a living room. And these images of how we understand home are therefore very important. But how we understand also the sustainable home is in a similar way, surrounded by these different norms and understandings. So I've been interested in looking at the integration of this. So between research and notions of home and the sustainable building research, which has been very technocentric, lack of holistic perspectives on home and these social and cognitive aspects. And likewise, the research on home and housing has largely been lacking this sustainability perspective. So you could simplify to say that the housing research has focused on the inner circle of the donut, and the sustainable building has been focusing on the outer circle. How can we sort of optimize and keep within limits and transition the building sector and so on. So I've looked at contemporary housing development in Sweden. From this is from Gothenburg, a new, well, recently new, you could say, housing development in Kvillebäcken, marketed as this sort of frontline sustainable housing development. Here we've done interviews with developers and architects to see what were their understandings, what type of sustainability, what interpretation of sustainability, and what conceptualization or what sort of understanding of home are they building here. And it's quite easy to sort of see this is quite conventional housing. It looks like it has for the past few decades. Very few innovations when it comes to sort of the housing concepts they deliver, but it's very efficient. So it's sort of, it meets, I think, gold standard for energy in the sustainable building measurements. Well, anyway, a certification system. But basically, you can say this is an energy efficient housing or building. But is it a sustainable home? If you look at what people do and how they live their lives, this is quite ordinary. And you could even argue that the people who live here are the ones that have the largest ecological footprint, because these are mostly middle-class households. It's mixed between sort of rental and tenant-owned, but still it's expensive. It's a newly built area. It's quite close to the city. And similar studies have looked at these areas and seen, well, these are actually the households where, for example, young professionals, architects, and others live. And those are also the people that have the highest impact in terms of when they go on vacation, they don't stay here. They actually fly much longer, and they sort of have a larger impact outside. So even though they might live quite efficient lives here because the walls are insulated and they can sort their trash directly on the courtyard, and it has this vacuum suction system that means the trash disappears and you don't have to see it again. So it's very much this making it easy to do the right thing. But it's maybe not always that solution. Maybe it shouldn't be easy to do the right thing, for example. So what we challenge here is that maybe it should be, so it's better they live here than in this suburbia, of course, you could always argue that. But this in itself is not changing our notion of the sustainable home. We looked at the existing stock, which is a huge part of the housing stock, of course, in Sweden and elsewhere. This is where the challenges will be. This is a typical area also in Gothenburg of the Million Homes program. Here I interviewed residents, sort of their perceptions of how do they view these types of solutions, or how do they understand what a sustainable housing development could be, and how do they see basically their view on home. And it's sort of confirming previous research. Well, home is something to do with this more social relations. It's actually quite negotiable when it comes to the resource use related to this. What's important is these things that I said. This, you could say, the bourgeois notion from the 19th century, but it's this idea of intimacy and privacy and control, family, and so on. But what's interesting is that people also talk a lot about, and this has been confirmed in other studies, and this general tendency now, you could say, that well, actually, you feel kind of limited. Well, I have all this stuff. I don't have anywhere to put it. It would be so nice to just sort of shed this. And that's a very interesting insight, but it's also related to this idea of, would people be willing to live in different ways to save resources or to live more sustainably, meaning within planetary boundaries? And there's, again, this negotiation. It depends on if these needs are met. Well, I could share things, I could share spaces with people, but it depends. There's a lot of, again, social norms. So a lot of people are living in, for example, apartments that are based on one elderly man, for example, has a quite large apartment here, and he talks about being sort of forced into it by his daughter because, well, it's good when the grandkids come to visit. So it's sort of beyond his immediate needs, but it's the social conventions. Another couple talk about, well, they would actually like to live in a different area, but when you have kids, well, you're supposed to want this, and you're supposed to provide your kids with certain things, and this is a stepping stone to the villa, where, of course, if you have a family, you're a bad parent if you're not living in the villa. These types of very strong social conventions. And the final study that I did in my PhD was related to this sort of, well, what about those that are actively seeking to live in more sustainable ways, but that are not any of the previous two. So they're not living in this new green urban development. And they've left the existing stock in terms of like the previous study, but they've often moved into, and this was a study with, could say, transitioners, so meaning people who are actively trying to be part of a transition to a sustainable society, but they're doing it in different ways. And this is a rural area, or a semi-rural municipality of Alingsås. And here it's also these ideas. What does it mean? Here the home is what's the interesting part. So this view on the home as not being this place of representation and consumption, which it is very much in this new sort of green development. Here it's rather a place for experimentation and where you allow certain things. It's not as perfect, but it's also understanding and approaching the home in different ways. But when it comes to the buildings, this is the opposite, right? So it's quite inefficient buildings here in a lot of these. In some cases, it's also newly built or self-built buildings, but that's not the important part. But is this then the sustainable home? Well, so what I saw was that there's this need to create wider, sort of other alternative images of this. We need to see what are these structural lock-ins in this mainstream understandings of sustainable housing development, and what's this interest among residents. On the other hand, we need to see the creation of new concepts. And here I use this idea of the home as a node. This idea that home is just sort of a node for everyday life. We have a tendency to segment, for example, in energy research, we say, okay, households account for so and so many percent and these different sectors, but people don't live their lives according to sectors. If I wake up in the morning, I don't think, oh, I'm gonna use some energy today. I live my life and that has consequences. If I have work, I go to work and maybe I have a gym membership and I go to the gym. I use water, electricity at the gym. If I'm unemployed, which we've seen in some of our studies, unemployed, if you're home on parental leave or so on, if you're retired, you spend time at home. You use resources at home. And this can't be as easily, so then how do you determine this? How do you understand what's sort of within the home and what's outside of this? Rather, this is a way of seeing home as an arena for transition, because home in research has shown to be that's sort of the single most important aspect of how we shape, again, our understanding of who we are and who we are in relation to the world around us. So this is sort of a way of seeing it as more as an integrated perspective. I'll skip and conclude with this, which is basically that we need to sort of say, so the question mark at the end needs to stay there. There isn't one concept, there isn't one sustainable home. So all of these different notions would say, so the eco-efficient buildings in areas like in Hammarby Sjöstad or Royal Seaport, well, that's one. They market themselves as being the sustainable home. There are alternative movements like the tiny house movement, which based sort of on a critique of these large-scale areas and very technocentric and saying, well, no, I want to plug out of that. But then there's the critique of that saying, well, everyone can live in tiny houses. That's completely unsustainable. So then you have sort of this clustering of eco-villages and other aspects, also critiquing what's sort of a aspect of isolation, both in these newly built eco-efficient urban areas and in these sort of tiny house. We can't do it alone, we need to do it together. And then there's these urban, for example, new urban co-housing that are also sort of combining these. All of these concepts and many more are claiming to be the sustainable solution. And that's what I find interesting is also how do we understand this? What are these different interpretations? And it depends on how you cut it. You know, is one more sustainable than the other? That's where we need to start discussing on what aspects. Is it helping us reach the space within the donut, this negotiation of what we see as these basic needs and the space, the operating space that we have? So that's the end of my lecture with this question mark at the end. So we have 10 minutes for questions and comments, and we have this little box that we'll throw around or send around. No? Okay. Sorry. Oh, okay. Thank you. I was like, Ellen wants the...
Thank you so much for your presentation. Very, very interesting. Two things I'm missing, at least what I get from presentation reading your PhD. First is a clear dividing on what is sustainable building and what is sustainable lifestyle.
Yeah.
Because now what I hear is mixture of both, and there are two different concepts having different methodologies and approaches.
Yeah.
Maybe it could be really useful to sustainable building, because it's well defined by several standards like LEED, BREEAM, whatever, with some KPIs and criteria what we mean when we call building a sustainable system. And another thing is sustainable lifestyle, which also could be, it could be easier to understand because you work with quite complex concepts which combine both in different proportion.
Yeah.
That could be super useful. And second, actually, one is more or less coming from perception theory, because in perception theory we have objective perception. This is a building.
Yeah.
The qualities of buildings. This is well isolated, like it's white, it's big, and stuff like this. Abstract qualities, where the concept of what is home coming, and the meaning, what is more like deeper coming to more cognitive science. Sometimes it's really when we come to like construction industries, they operate on objective or qualities of the building.
Exactly.
And they just don't understand abstract qualities and meanings of the object we're talking about. It also could be interesting to see in the future of your research how you can help to provide a tool for different kind of the stakeholders to understand the complexity of the system you're working with.
Yeah.
So maybe you can comment on both of this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I mean, so I could take the easy way out and saying, so that's what my work actually tries to pinpoint, that we can't talk about sustainable building because there is no such thing without this holistic perspective of what is this donut that we're creating. So you could say that it's more or less, so it's perhaps better in certain, if we're building a new area, it's better if we certify it by BREEAM or LEED than if we didn't. But we can't say that that's the sustainable development towards this life within the donut if we do not also incorporate these other dimensions. So that's sort of taking this argument to say that we need to understand this complexity between sustainable lifestyles and sustainable building. But so from this, I've done a lot of, so since the PhD, my work has been a lot on how different actors within the housing development sector sort of understand their roles in this. And there I would say, so it's more your second question, that yes, okay, it's commonly that the construction industry, they only understand these sort of objective or quantitative. And that's also what we've seen in like the Kvillebecken development, sort of the checklist for the environmental perspectives, yep. Social indicators, somewhat. But more than that, yeah, it's the competence is not there. But that's sort of, you could say that that's lacking a perspective on the fact that everyone is human. Everyone has a relationship to home. There's all these assumptions and understandings also within the housing sector. So a sustainability manager at a large construction company will have his or her understandings and reproducing certain norms, so I've looked at, for example, this one sustainability manager talked about this, that, well, as being educated, for example, in an environment like this at KTH, we learn certain challenges, but who are the CEOs of the companies? Well, they went to another type of school where they barely had any lectures on these challenges. And there's the direct, and it's not that they're ignorant or greedy or anything, it has to do with competence and perspectives. So we need to handle complexity and we need to understand, and this would be, I had a research director who was a very sort of this objective engineer, and he talked about the one thing he learned from my work was that, okay, we need to let social sciences and humanist sort of, what do you say, humanism, humanitarian aspects into sustainability research. That seems obvious, but that was sort of his one, oh, we have to understand why we're doing something. It's not only about these objectives. I think that's, if I've done anything in my whole research career, I got this one super engineer to say that. But it has a lot to do with perspectives and competencies. So trying to integrate rather than pulling apart and putting checklists on everything. But that's a challenge. That's what I'm working with now. Sorry, a long answer. Ja.
Nej, förlåt. Jag har en lite otydlig fråga. Men den här cirkeln, den här donuten som du pratar om. Utgår du från den? Eller jag antar att du liksom kanske har den som utgångspunkt på något sätt. Har jag uppfattat det rätt då?
Ja.
För det är inte det som är min fråga egentligen.
Ja, okej.
Men för att liksom, det känns som att den är väldigt abstraherad. Och när man liksom, för om det liksom är utgångspunkten, vad representerar den i, och exakt liksom, det anknyter kanske för mycket till det du förklarade nyss, men liksom hur den situerar sig i en liberal kapitalistisk ekonomi.
Precis.
Och vad du liksom, vad utgångspunkten egentligen är. Och liksom om man tänker på att vi lever i en ekonomi som är tillväxtbaserad liksom, och allt det här, de urbana projekt som du tar upp som förhåller sig till ekologi men också inom det givna systemet. Hur liksom, blir inte att man kanske tar som en ganska lång omväg för att säga någonting, alltså att den här abstraktionen kan man går att tolka på väldigt olika sätt, men om man pratar om hållbarhet och kanske någon aspekt av någon ekosocialism eller något sånt, eller exakt vad är liksom cirkeln och hur att det känns som en ganska viktig grej att definiera från början kanske.
Precis, och det är därför jag säger så här,
om du förstår min fråga,
ja,
det är jätteotydligt.
Nej, men absolut. Ja. Kan jag svara på engelska så kan vi... Ja. So basically, well, okay, I'll do the answer and then you'll understand the question hopefully through that. But basically this idea of the donut economics, this model. So I'm very wary of using models because they're a simplification of reality. But I see that this has a purpose in exactly what I was talking about, to see this as this space, not as defined, but as negotiated. I think that's the most important. And this negotiation of the distribution of resources and the organization of society is politics. So it's a political economic perspective. And so the research I've done, which I didn't talk about now, is, for example, within a project looking at future scenarios beyond growth. So sustainable development beyond growth, which I see, and that's sort of my starting point. And the point that this is not this Venn diagram of economic, ecological, social sustainability is that that's an inaccurate understanding of sustainability, and we should stop reproducing that. So that's why the donut model actually talks about we need to discuss where we want to go. What is this sustainable life in the donut? That should be our starting point. So that's my starting point. Not so much if it's a donut or if it's any other cake or something, but rather like where do we start in that? And the way I worked with that is critically challenging these norms that are inflicted in this. So I talk a lot about, for example, the global financial system being interlinked with mortgage systems, being interlinked with how we understand what a good home is. That's also something that's very much enforced by this. It's not what we want to live in currently, but studies show that we think so much about who's going to buy it after us, that we actually live our lives in something that we don't like, but we think, well, white tiles, that has a resale value. So that's really interesting. That's shaping, this global mortgaging system is also actively shaping what homes we build and how we view homes. Not to mention, of course, the global real estate market and the rental system, which is also shaping this in different ways. So that's, yeah, it's not an answer, but it's just saying those are perspectives behind this. But then here I see as the basis for this are these norms that we talk about and how they're upheld in different systems. So that's where I choose. My research is more on this everyday practices and perspectives, but of course how it connects to all these large-scale systems that are shaping our operating space and so on. Yeah.
Unfortunately, the time is out. Thank you so much, Pernilla. That's a little present from the library.
Thank you. I've actually wanted one of these. Thank you.